reason I wanted to bring up Andre Johnson is because I pulled up some numbers just looking at how heavy Kubiak offenses often lean on their number one wide receiver, which we saw the Vikings have to do with Stefon Diggs last year, and Diggs was very successful in doing so. And some of these numbers blew my mind for how much Texan quarterbacks, yourself included, threw to Andre Johnson. Target numbers are just preposterous. 163 one year, back-to-back seasons of 171, and in 2013, 181 targets went in Andre Johnson's direction. Ridiculous. But here's the point. I looked up one of his top seasons, and the second best receiver only had something like 80 targets. I think it was the great Ken Walter.
Kevin Walter.
Whatever.
Yes. Not Walters.
Kevin Walter. Sorry, I thought it was Ken. It doesn't matter. Sorry,
it
Kevin Walter. Only to his family. So I was thinking about how this offense operates. It does operate with a tight end that gets a lot of targets. Owen Daniels. I would never mess up his name because
Owen Daniels, Joel Jurison, for the most part, were the two tight ends in that offense.
No one loves Owen Daniels more than Gary Kubiak in this entire world. He took him to Baltimore with him and everything. So
Denver also.
Anyway, the point is the Vikings have two very good tight ends, and they only have one good wide receiver now in Adam Thielen. And in the past, when we've seen Adam Thielen need to carry the load with Stefon Diggs out, that has not worked out particularly well. But in this offense, I want your opinion. Will it still work without Stefon Diggs? I'm not saying that they're better without Stefon Diggs, but considering that one guy dominated the targets by this much in Kubiak's entire time in Houston, that might have to be the case here with Thielen this year.
Well, it's going to be different. I think what's different from the last few years, I think they're going to try to throw to the tight end more. I got to think with you have to have that one of the two tight ends be basically a wide receiver in a sense and be a legitimate threat. So they're going to have others to have sort of a balance to it if you don't have that sort of premier second wide receiver. And no, at that time in Houston, and I love K-Dubs, Kevin Walter, but he wasn't a second receiver that scared the heck out of football teams. He did everything exactly right. He was super consistent. He blocked like crazy. He did catch the balls that were going his way, but he wasn't a guy we're trying to throw 50-50 balls down the field on one-on-one. Andre was the dominant wide receiver, but he was so good, and I think he's a Hall of Fame player. He's hands down the best player. Well, I should say, probably him and J.J. Watt in Texans history, but he was just dominant. He was physically imposing. He could really run. He was good at the line for slants and sort of the big receiver type of throws. And so Gary Kubiak's one of those guys who goes, who are the best players on our team? Well, I'm going to get them the ball the most. And he finds ways to do that by formations but to try to, in whatever concept you might run, you can run these various pass plays and concepts, but put different people in different places. Well, if you make Andre Johnson more often than not the number one guy or the number two guy, he ends up getting a lot of balls that came his way or whatever. So, Thielen's had years though where he had 150. 2 years ago, he had 153 balls thrown his way. So he has been in situations where he had a lot of targets and things like that. But, Gary does a phenomenal job of, even though the other team knows we're trying to get the ball to Andre Johnson, Gary did a great job in those years in Houston, and some with Kyle Shanahan and some years without Kyle Shanahan, but of finding ways to get Andre the ball despite the fact the defense knew we were trying to get him the football.
Side note, Andre Johnson has more receiving yards than Chris Carter in his career. That's crazy. 11th all time.
And had a little bit of bad luck of coming into a brand new franchise in their second year of existence, and David Carr was his quarterback, and the offense was terrible his first couple of years. It was that offense when we first showed up there, they were 31st or 32nd in the league in like every single category. Defense wasn't very good either. So and he never played with great. I wasn't a great quarterback, and I think Matt Shaw was a great quarterback, but still put up just Hall of Fame type numbers without being on great offenses. And Chris Carter was on better football teams and maybe better all around offenses. But Andre, I think he's a Hall of Famer. I think he wasn't in the right franchise.
Yeah, I mean his numbers. It's hard for a wide receiver when great receivers like Andre Reed have to wait. That really tells you kind of how stacked up we are with receivers. Steve Smith is 8th all time in receiving yards, and he might never get in, or it might take a really long time. And I think he was a Hall of Fame player too. But back to the Vikings' point about this, I don't think that Adam Thielen is Andre Johnson. I think Andre Johnson is a much better receiver than Adam Thielen. Like you said, one of the all-time greats. But, Kirk Cousins is a better quarterback than a lot of the quarterbacks Andre Johnson played with. I guess I wonder, more pressure on Adam Thielen to carry the passing game or to Irv Smith to take a huge step forward?
Thielen has to be big this year. When you get rid of a number one wide receiver and probably a better wide receiver, Diggs at this point, you have to step up, and so he has to have a big year. If if he doesn't have over 80 catches, I don't know how good the Vikings are going to be this year. He has to put up really big numbers. He has to have a sort of a career type of year. And also on top of it, I do think he's not going to be an Andre Johnson. He's not going to completely carry the load. So the Vikings need to get other weapons, and one of those is Irv Smith. Rui's going to have some different things maybe that he can do. But then, of course, the young guy is coming up. The guy they just Tajay, is that how you say his name?
Tajay Sharp. Yep.
Sharp. Where is he at? And then, what do they do in this draft? If and when this draft occurs, do they get a sort of a number one guy on the other side, even though he's young? But maybe, fairlier in the season, he could, crack the starting lineup and be a big threat, a guy that can run, a 4-3-5 guy or something like that to open things up for Adam Thielen underneath, because he just does not have that extreme speed down the field, even as much as Stefon Diggs had.
Yeah, and I wonder if just because of the injuries, I mean, there's reason to be down on Thielen. I don't think that there necessarily is. When you look at his age, usually receivers are good until their mid-30s. Even Andre Johnson was good until probably age 33 when he started to fade a little bit, and he had played much more and for much longer than someone like Adam Thielen. So I would have a higher expectation, but it also means he's going to have to take on a little bit different of a role than he's had over the last couple of years. He played a lot in the slot over the last 3 seasons, and now he's going to have to be outside all the time. And it's a really interesting role for outside wide receivers in Kubiak's offense. I mean, you've broken down some of the plays on our YouTube, and we've talked about them at times, but deep crossers and things like that, like getting deep separation and then making plays on the ball. He's really great at that. When the ball is in the air, he can make the play. But then, the underneath stuff, and I don't know. I think it's a lot to handle for any wide receiver.
I think Kubiak does a really good job of taking an outside receiver, you think of as an outside receiver, and then finding ways to get him on the inside. So he does get those matchups, and Adam does have a great feel for the game, feel for man, feel for zone.
Yep.
He does a nice job of separating from people. He just sort of has that, without being some insane athlete, ability to separate for the underneath stuff. In a lot of ways, he's a great possession receiver.
Yeah. Yep.
In some ways he is sort of like Chris Carter. He's not a burner down the field. He needs that other aspect of his game, of the team, so he can really flourish. He's great. He's got great feel, of course, great with catching the football and those types of things, but he's got a savviness to him, and I think Gary will use that as use a smart player like that. You can, there's times where Gary would line Andre Johnson up in the backfield as like a tailback and then motion him out into the slot, so you could help identify that for him and for the quarterback of who was going to have him, or even line him up as almost a backside tight end in a 3 wide receiver set in a 3-point stance, and make him sort of hide him in there and before you motion him or do something. So they have ways to try to get a defense to sort of to tell us what you're doing over there, and then to move a premier player around to try to get him the ball based off of what type of coverage they might be in.
Well, the most interesting thing about Thielen is that he's from Mankato. I don't know if you've heard this at all, that, small school guy who's turned it. Sorry. It's just every broadcast ever that covers the Minnesota Vikings is, Detroit likes Minnesota, Mankato kid.
I
Anyway,
always love the every time there's like a smaller receiver, it's always like he's a good route runner.
really reminds me of Julian
He's a
Edelman. He's a Wes
coach's
Welker type.
son, hard worker. All those they sort of go through the cliches of like the wide receiver, good route. It's why wouldn't you be a good route runner? Well, being a good route runner is not. Of course, you're going to run the route the depth. It's the ability to separate. That's what a lot of times a good route runner is, and consistently run routes sort of the same every time. That's hard to do when you're running as fast as you can, and you roll out of it or you break it down for a curl route. That's hard to be consistently good at that, and then again have great feel. And Adam has, I assume he's a good basketball player. I don't know much about.
He was a great basketball player. I wrote a story about it once.
So he plays football that way. He's got great spatial awareness and recognition, and that cannot be taught, but it can be helped with the right coordinator.
Yes. Also, sneaky athletic comes up every time. He's just not a great athlete, but he goes up and gets it. Anyway, it's sort of funny. But
he does have great hand-eye coordination, and that's where I think when people, if you want your kid to play football, get them to play basketball. Basketball is a great sport, whether they're big and they're going to be a lineman or whatever. The footwork, the spatial awareness and recognition, the movement to stop and go and back and forth. It's a great sport. I think it's probably the best sport to become a good football player is to be a good basketball player first.
It's also a little bit of a misnomer, I think, when we talk about athleticism just through the context of NFL combine scores, which Thielen didn't have. He had a pro day instead. But in my mind, athleticism is being able to contort your body, falling down and keep your eye on the ball and being able to make a catch. Like that is an extremely highly athletic move to be able to do that, or to break down out of a route. If you're stiff coming out of routes, you've seen guys like this. It's funny to watch in comparison to great route runners.
Yeah, so there's athleticism and then there's fine skill, what I would call a sort of fine skill, like dribbling a basketball, dribbling a soccer ball, hitting a golf ball. That's about as fine a skill as you can think of. I mean, it's or hitting a baseball, super, 1/10 of an inch matters, super fine. In that football is sort of a brute strength, type of thing. The throwing, the catching, and those types of things, that is sort of the fine skill. And people don't realize how hard it is to run as fast as you can and be super efficient in and out of your breaks and things like that. And it does happen for all these college football teams and stuff. A lot of times guys that were maybe on the track team decide to go out for the football team. It doesn't work out very well because you just don't realize how these players have been working on the fine skill of route running since they were in middle